Hi, welcome. I'm Jill Blair at Materiala.com. I'm just going to try to rip through this and share some of the things I'm learning as I make my silk patchwork scarf project. This is an upcycle and or recycle kind of project. I thought it might be useful to somebody who's interested in doing that sort of thing, or to people who want to make some memory quilts but smaller pieces, which is what I'm aiming for here. Memory quilts that you can make multiple memory quilts from a collection of clothing that you get, either from ties or shirts or skirts or what have you. And in this case, I'm working with silk. And of course, silk ties are a really common silk item in our culture. And you can get silk ties, of course, from grandfathers and fathers' collections, or blouses and skirts, like I said, and trousers from women in the family. You can also, if you need to pad out a collection, go to Goodwill or secondhand shops, and that's where I found a bunch to add to mine. And my husband's ties, I've added some of his old ones that he stopped wearing. And then I washed my ties in cold and warm loads. I've done a few at different times. And that way this fabric becomes something that I can wash in the future too. I want a scarf. It's going to get makeup and hair stuff on it, and I want to be able to wash it at least in a gentle load in my machine or by hand in the sink. So I'm going to go ahead and wash all my materials before I start working with them. Some people still want to dry clean silk after they've done this, and I wouldn't personally do that, but you can do whatever you want, right? So here's a tie. It's been through the wash, it's been through the dryer, and you can see that it's got some puckering now that it probably didn't have when it was first made. And with these ties, you're just going to take out any little tacking stitch down there, cut the label out. Some people want to reuse those. I've just been cutting mine in half and ripping out the seams. And then after you've got those opened out, you can just take a seam ripper or scissor and open up those tacking stitches along the back. They're just basically whip stitched in there. So you'll see here this thread coming out. Some of these threads, if you really like hand quilting, you might want to keep some of them because they're nice heavy weight, almost like a pearl cotton, or possibly they're a silk. I haven't tested mine. And then inside the tie, after you rip all that out, you're going to pull out your interfacing, and it may or may not be tacked. Like this one is tacked in here with a few stitches, and those I've just been ripping out. And this little lining that's at the wide end, and then there's a little bit at the narrow end also. I'm cutting that out, and then I'm pressing the tie, and I'm using some best press and a hot iron to try to get that material as stable as I can before I start cutting into it. This tie, for example, nice wide tie, right? Kind of crazy. This was really wobbly. Ties are cut on the bias. So this was originally cut out of a big, let's say this is your big rectangle of fabric. This piece was cut this way across the fabric so that there's a lot of stretch in this direction. You see all that give there? And then there's a lot of give here across this way. This is actually, when I turn it this way, this is the straight of grain, either the straight or cross grain. And then vertically here, if I can do this in reverse, that's going to be, again, grain or straight, cross grain or straight of grain. You might, with a quilt, consider cutting this on grain. So cutting a square like right here. But I'm going to cut, I've been cutting, and I'm going to continue to cut as if this is my straight direction, so that I get my squares on the bias. And then they're going to have a little more flexibility on the seams. Of course, I'm going to have to be very careful as I'm sewing them and handling them. But then all of those seams will have some give, and I'm hoping will give it a little more, the scarf, a little more give and crushability. I also have collected some home decor silks. These came on cards, and I had to wash them and soak them and get the paper off. If the paper gave me a really hard time, I had to soak it and pull it, and that started some of the pieces fraying a lot. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to cut all that off. I don't want to worry about this piece like fraying in the seam, have its seams fraying while I'm wearing it and start coming apart. So I'm not going to use those, and I'm not going to work too hard at getting the papers off. I've just been cutting those pieces and tossing them. But some of these silk decor pieces are actually really nice. They're fine on the bias for using in this piece, and I like the colors, so I am cutting a few of them. Some of the ties that I washed, I found that the dye ran a little bit, and there are projects where you can use these ties as the dye to put on other fabrics, right? There's a good video for that. In this piece in particular, that red started to run. It's also a fairly thin silk with a lot of play, so I don't think I'm going to use it in this project. If I wanted it in a quilt, I might interface it like with some Pellon, I want to say it's SF101, the kind of stuff you use for a t-shirt quilt. I might put a little fusible interfacing on the back of that and use it. But in general, this silk, this dye was bleeding, so I don't want that splotchiness, and I don't want that to happen more as I wash it in the future, so I'm not going to be using that. This was another silk tie that was kind of thin, and it has a lot of play. Here's its bias. And it might not seem quite as stretchy as that other one, but even with best press and a couple layers and a lot of pressing, it never really stiffened up because it's a thinner piece. And I did try to cut a square out of here on grain, so I cut it this direction, and it still came out a little bit stretchier than I would like. It came out, instead of a little square, I've really got more of a diamond shape or a trapezoid going. So I might not use this because it turns into a diamond shape a little too easily. We'll see if I have enough squares. I decided that I wanted my scarf that I'm going to start working on to be about anywhere from 10 to 12, maybe 13 inches wide by 60 inches long. And I was basing that off of a scarf that I already have. That's a good wrap length for winter, and that's going to keep my neck warm and be nice and comfortable. I can probably tie a knot in it if I want to. So based on that, and based on the general size of cuts that I could get out of the ends of the ties, I decided to cut 3-inch squares, and then I also ended up with some larger squares because some of my wide ties at the end had plenty of room to do big squares. I figured that to get the length that I wanted, so my 3-inch squares, I'm going to use a 1/4-inch seam allowance because I'm a quilter. And that might be a little small since this is a garment, right? Usually with garment you do a 5/8 inch, but I'm going to apply my quilting toolbox here on this. I figured I would need 120 squares at 3 inches just to make this scarf. Because 3 inches, they're going to finish at 2.5 inches, and I'm going to make 5 across, and I'll need 25 rows because that'll give me a 12.5 by 60-inch scarf roughly. You can probably get 15 3-inch squares from a tie. I figured I'd need at least 8 to 12 ties depending on the width, and luckily I have some of those home decor pieces, you know, that started out large that I could cut a bunch of squares from too. So these are my 3-inch squares. This is one of those home decor pieces, pretty good square, not too stretchy. And again, I've sprayed the heck out of these with some best press. This is a good example of a pretty stretchy and soft but thick silk from a tie, and I'm going to have to be very careful handling this because if I started pulling on that edge, again, that's my bias there because of the way I cut it off the tie, and so it's going to have a lot of play, so I got to be very careful. Those are my 3-inch squares, but some of my ties, like I said, were big enough that I've been able to get larger squares. My 3-inch squares are going to finish at 2.5, so that means I need something that's going to finish at 5 inches to be 4 of those units, right? So I've cut 5.5-inch squares, and that's fit pretty well into some ties. So this is 5.5-inch square off of a tie, as is this one, this dark one, and I've got my crazy purple orange paisley. And then the home decors, these are a little bit of a different texture. You can see that. And I did cut this one. You can see there's the grain, right? I cut it slightly on the bias, not all the way, just to have a little bit of that softness, but it's going to be fine once it's sewn together, I think. I hope. The other item then is the backing, and I have a couple of choices for backing. I do have some raw silk material. Now this is something not everybody associates with silk, but you can see that this has a lot of slubbing and variation in the threads. It's a nice soft, warm, and strong fabric. I don't have enough to cut this on the bias, so this piece will have to probably be straight of grain, but I think that'll be fine. I'm going to have to piece it, but I think that this will be soft enough and then warm enough to be a really nice piece. I also think that, like I said, this scarf, this larger scarf that I used to have, I might be able to, if I use something to fuse my patchwork to this, I could possibly use that as a backing piece for this scarf. And then also some of the wovens, like this is some of that Cape Facet woven stripe. It's very soft. It might be nice to do on the bias. I've got some cotton sateen. That's just a satin weave but done with cotton. That's a very soft, nice fabric against the skin. That could make a good backing, and or a good old homespun. This one I thought had a nice interesting texture and some threads. If you're unsure if some of your ties are silk, you can give them a burn test. And I do have a couple of pieces here that I was curious about, and I just clipped off a little bit. And then you can take a match or use your gas burner on a stove or whatever, but do this safely, right? I've got a salad plate under here that I'm going to use and let the ashes fall on. And then with any natural fiber, if it continues to burn after you remove the flame, see, that's continuing to burn. I thought so. So that's a polyester, or that's some sort of blend. It doesn't smell too bad. If it's pure silk, it will just smell kind of organic or herby, is how some of the silks I've tested have smelled. And this is a good test to do on fabrics that you know also. Like actually take some fabrics that you know are all cotton or all silk, and then go ahead and give them burn tests so that you understand the properties. If this beaded up also after I burned it, so here's the piece I just burned. Yeah, and it like melted together. So I was pretty sure it was at best a blend, and you know, at worst all polyester or something and not a silk. And I don't mean that in a terribly judgmental way. I'm just looking for all silks in this project because I had enough silk ties to start with. And then this other piece, I'm going to do the same thing just to see. Here's my flame. And let's see how that behaves. I don't honestly think that this is 100%. Okay, the flame's still going. So I have to look. Yeah, and it melted. It didn't ash. If it's pure silk, it's going to actually kind of crush, have a nice crushable ash to it when you're done burning it. So like this silk scarf that I know is silk, I've actually run some holes in it. I'm going to burn it. And the flame keeps going out, right? I can apply the flame, but it keeps going out. And then this did not bead up like it's plastic. It's a nice crushable, I don't know, shoot, I don't know if you can see that, but it's a nice crushable, soft ash that comes off of that. So that's your burn test if you want to try that to make sure you have silks. I think that's really about all. I need to keep cutting more so I can share more, but that's the stuff I wanted to cover for now. So thank you, and I hope this is some good or useful information for you. Thanks. Bye.